The woman's boots made no sound on the wet cobblestones. She moved through the alley behind George Yard buildings, past the open doorway where lamplight spilled across brick worn smooth by a century of coal smoke and rain. It was August, the 7th hour past midnight, and the air carried the thick scent of horse dung, rotting vegetables, and the sweet-sour tang of gin. Somewhere in the darkness, a child coughed. A door slammed. The woman paused at the landing of the first-floor stairwell, her hand against the wall steadying herself. She did not know, could not know that within 3 hours her body would be discovered on those same stairs, her throat pierced 39 times, her chest bearing wounds beyond counting. Her name was Martha Tabram. She was 40 years old. She sold matches when she could, and herself when she could not. The city had already forgotten her before she died, but on this night, in this narrow passage where the gaslight could not reach, history held its breath. The footsteps behind her were soft, the blade was silent, and Whitechapel, ancient and indifferent, turned its face toward the coming storm. The first scream never came, only silence, and then the slow drip of rain from the eaves above. Chapter 1. The Abyss at the Empire's Heart. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn its curtain, and the world beyond your window has grown quiet. Wherever you're listening, perhaps beneath blankets, perhaps in the stillness of an ending day, I wonder, what hour finds you now? What city, what country, what small corner of the earth claims you in this moment? If you would, leave a word below. Tell me where you rest tonight, and what time the clock has struck in your part of the world. And if these whispered histories bring you comfort in the dark hours, consider subscribing to this channel. Let the algorithm know that there are still those who seek the past, who wish to remember what the centuries have tried to forget. It helps more than you might imagine. Each subscription, each quiet gesture of support, allows us to continue descending into history's shadowed chambers together. Now let us drift backward. Let us leave behind the modern world with all its light and noise, and slip into the London of 1888, into a place called Whitechapel, where the old streets of England had become a labyrinth of despair, and where violence, ancient and patient, was preparing to write its name across the throat of the empire itself. The summer had been long and unusually warm. In the West End, where the broad avenues carried carriages and the townhouses, stood 4 stories tall with iron railings painted black. The heat had been an inconvenience, a reason to take the waters at Bath, to retreat to country estates where the air moved freely through the trees. But in the East End, in Whitechapel and Spitalfields, and the tangle of courts and alleys that pressed against the docks, the heat had been something else entirely. It had settled over the narrow streets like a fever, drawing out the stench from the gutters where waste ran in the open channels, from the slaughterhouses on Winthrop Street where the blood of cattle pooled in the cobblestones, from the leather factories and the rag-sorting warehouses and the tenements where 20 souls might share a single room with no window to the outside air. Whitechapel had been old when the Tudors ruled England. The parish church of St. Mary Matphelan, called St. Mary's Whitechapel, stood where it had stood since the 14th century, its bells ringing the hours over streets that had borne witness to plague and fire, to reformation and revolt. But by the year 1888, the ancient village had been consumed by the city's expansion, swallowed into the great beast of London until it had become something unrecognisable. A district of approximately 250,000 people pressed into less than a square mile, where the buildings leaned against one another like drunken men, and where the courts had names that spoke of what they had become. Dorset Street, called the worst street in London, Flower and Dean Street, where the police walked in pairs if they walked at all, Thrall Street, Fashion Street, Wentworth Street, a geography of poverty so dense that the maps themselves seemed to darken when they reached the eastern boundary of the city. The people who lived there worked when they could find work. They hauled cargo at the docks where ships arrived daily from every corner of the empire carrying tea and silk and spices, where fortunes were made and unmade on the turn of the tide. They laboured in the match factories, breathing phosphorus until their jaws rotted. They sewed clothing in sweatshops 12 hours at a stretch, for wages that would not pay for bread and coal both. They sorted rags, cleaned stables, sold flowers, mended shoes, hawked newspapers. And when there was no work, or when age or drink or simple exhaustion had made them unfit for labour, they did what they had always done in the old streets of England. They survived however they could. The common lodging houses stood at the centre of this economy of survival. They were called doss houses by those who used them, and they lined the streets in numbers beyond counting. Crossingham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, the White House on Flower and Dean, Cooney's on Thrall Street, Wilmot's on Brick Lane. Each one operated on the same principle: fourpence for a bed, twopence for a seat in the kitchen. The deputy, the man or woman who managed the house for the owner, kept watch over the entrance, collecting coins, maintaining order, ensuring that those who could not pay were turned out into the street regardless of the hour or the weather. Inside, the lodgers slept in rooms called dormitories, where wooden beds stood in rows so close together that a person could reach from one to the next without rising. The air in these rooms carried the smell of unwashed bodies, of cheap tobacco, of the carbolic soap used to fight the lice that bred in the mattresses and blankets. There was no privacy in the lodging houses. The thin partitions between the beds offered only the illusion of separation. Sound travelled freely, coughing, weeping, the particular rhythms of intimacy, the arguments over pennies or accusations of theft. The kitchens, located on the ground floors, served as gathering places where the lodgers could boil water for tea if they had tea, or simply sit near the fire if they had nowhere else to be. In summer, these kitchens were stifling. In winter, they were the only warmth available to those who had sold or pawned everything they owned, down to the clothes on their backs. The women who would later be called the victims of the Whitechapel murders lived in these houses, or moved between them, or spent their nights in the streets when they could not gather the fourpence required for shelter. They were past youth, most of them. They ranged in age from the late 30s to the middle 40s, a span of years that had left its mark in lines around the eyes, in missing teeth, in the slight stoop of shoulders that had carried too much for too long. They had been married, some of them, or had lived as though married. They had borne children who were grown now, or dead, or lost somewhere in the vastness of London's poor. They had worked in service, in factories, in laundries. They had known other lives before they had come to this. But those other lives had ended, the way lives ended for women without property, without family, without the protection that respectable society offered to those who could afford its price. Husbands died, or left, or drank away the household money until there was nothing left. Employers dismissed servants who grew too old, too slow, too familiar with the bottle. The machinery of Victorian charity, the workhouses, the missions, the societies for the reformation of fallen women, stood ready to receive them. But the workhouse meant separation from family, meant hard labour, meant surrendering whatever small freedom poverty still allowed, and so they chose the streets instead. They chose to walk the corners near the public houses, to stand in the doorways of shops closed for the night, to offer themselves for pennies to men who wanted what they wanted and did not care to know the names of those who provided it. The police knew them. The constables who walked the beats in Whitechapel saw the same faces night after night, learned to recognise them in the gaslight, sometimes stopped to exchange a word or offer a warning about particularly dangerous customers. The law called it solicitation, and it was illegal, but the law was enforced unevenly, if at all. A woman might be arrested if she caused a disturbance, or if she solicited too boldly, or if a constable needed to meet his quota of arrests for the month. But most of the time, the police simply watched. They knew the women by sight, knew their habits, knew which public houses they favoured, and which alleys they used when they found a customer willing to pay. The city itself seemed built for such transactions. The courts and alleyways that branched off from the main streets created a warren of dark spaces where privacy could be purchased for a few moments. Some of these passages were barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. They had names, though few beyond the immediate residents knew them. Miller's Court, Castle Alley, Gunthorpe Street, Batty Street, George Yard. The buildings rose on either side, blocking out the sky, so that even on clear nights the stars were invisible, and the only light came from whatever lamps had been placed near the entrances to the main thoroughfares. The ground was cobblestone in some places, hard-packed earth in others. In wet weather, and London knew much wet weather, the alleys became streams of filth, ankle-deep in places, carrying the waste from the buildings and the streets into the gutters and eventually into the Thames. By August of 1888, Whitechapel had become a place that the rest of London preferred not to acknowledge. The newspapers occasionally published accounts of conditions in the East End, usually during periods of particular unrest, or when some incident demanded attention, But these reports were read by people who had never set foot in such districts themselves, who could afford to feel a moment of distant sympathy before turning the page to more pleasant subjects. The empire was at its height. Victoria had reigned for 51 years, and Britain controlled territories spanning a quarter of the Earth's surface. The wealth flowing into London from India, from Africa, from the islands of the Caribbean and the Pacific was staggering in its scale. But that wealth did not reach Whitechapel. It flowed past, carried in ships that docked at the wharves, where Whitechapel's men and women laboured for wages that kept them perpetually on the edge of starvation, and then it moved westward, into the banks and counting houses, into the great estates and the halls of Parliament, leaving behind only the residue of its passage, the empty crates, the smell of exotic cargo, the knowledge that somewhere, very close, people lived in circumstances that the poorest labourer in Whitechapel could barely imagine. In the pubs that lined Whitechapel Road and Commercial Street, men and women gathered each evening when the workday ended, or when the search for work had proven fruitless. The 10 Bells stood on the corner of Commercial Street and Fournier Street, its windows glowing with lamplight, its interior thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled beer. The Britannia occupied the ground floor of a building on the corner of Dorset and Commercial, serving gin and ale to a clientele that included labourers, merchants, casual workers, and the women who worked the streets. The Frying Pan on Brick Lane, the Queen's Head, the Princess Alice on Commercial Street. Each had its regulars, its particular character, its unwritten rules about what behaviour would be tolerated and what would result in ejection into the street. The drink itself was various, beer and ale for those who could afford threepence or fourpence. Gin for those who could not, cheap gin sold by the glass or the bottle, gin that burned the throat and warmed the stomach and made the world seem temporarily less cruel than it was. The temperance movement had made inroads even in Whitechapel, establishing missions and holding meetings where reformed drinkers testified to the damage that alcohol had wrought in their lives, but the pubs remained full. They offered heat in winter, companionship, the possibility of conversation, the chance to forget for a few hours the narrow room or the absence of a room, the hunger that was always present, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring only more of the same. It was from these pubs that the women emerged as the evening grew late, making their way to their customary corners, or walking the darker streets in search of custom. They knew the risks. Violence was common enough. A customer who turned rough, who refused to pay, who carried a knife or simply used his fists. Some women worked in pairs for protection, though this was not always possible. Some knew to stay in areas where foot traffic remained steady even late at night, where a scream might bring witnesses. But necessity drove them into the darker corners, into the alleys and courts where the risk was greater, but where customers willing to pay for privacy could be found. The city watched, in its way, the constables on their beats, the residents who peered from windows when sounds in the street below disturbed their sleep. The early morning workers, market porters, bakers, stablemen, who moved through Whitechapel in the hours before dawn and sometimes found what the night had left behind. London in 1888 had no forensic science as the 20th century would come to know it. There were no fingerprints on file, no photographs of crime scenes routinely taken, no systematic method for analysing blood or other physical evidence. The police relied on witnesses, on confessions, on catching criminals in the act, or through information provided by informants. The detection of crime was largely a matter of asking questions, following leads, hoping that someone had seen something useful, and so the summer progressed, day following day, each one much like the one before. The heat continued, the streets smelled of horse and human waste, of industry, of the river when the wind came from the south. The lodging houses filled each night with those who had earned or begged or stolen the price of a bed. The pubs closed at their appointed hours, emptying their patrons into the streets, and the women walked, as they had walked for years, as they would continue to walk, offering what they had to sell to a city that bought without acknowledgement, without record, without any indication that it cared whether they lived or died. But history was watching. In the courts and alleys, in the narrow passages where the gaslight could not reach, something was beginning that would transform Whitechapel from an anonymous slum into a name that would echo across centuries. The pattern had not yet emerged. The deaths that were coming had not yet arranged themselves into the sequence that would make them unforgettable. But the ground was prepared. The stage was set, and the first blood had already been spilled, though no one yet understood what it meant, or what was about to follow. Chapter 2. The women of the corners. They had names, though the city rarely used them. They had histories, though few cared to know them. They had been daughters once, some of them wives, some of them mothers. They had known other streets, other rooms, other possibilities. But by the summer of 1888, their lives had narrowed to the geography of Whitechapel, to the lodging houses where fourpence bought a night's shelter, to the public houses where gin could be purchased for twopence a glass, to the corners and doorways where they waited for men who would pay for what they offered. The Victorian world had 100 names for such women, none of them kind. The law called them common prostitutes. The newspapers called them unfortunates. The missions and charitable societies called them fallen women, as though virtue were a precipice from which one might tumble and never climb back. But the women themselves used simpler language. They spoke of being on the streets, of doing business, of earning the doss, the fourpence needed to secure a bed for the night. They knew what they were, and they knew that the alternative to walking the streets was the workhouse, where families were separated, where hard labour was mandatory, where the only freedom was the freedom to leave and return to exactly the circumstances that had driven them there in the first place. The oldest among them had been born in the early 1840s, in the years when Victoria was still young, when the railways were transforming England, when the great expansion of industry promised prosperity that somehow never reached the lowest rungs of society. They had grown up in a world that offered women few paths. A respectable woman married and bore children, and managed a household within the limits of whatever income her husband could provide. A woman without family connections might enter service, working as a maid or cook in the houses of the middle and upper classes, subject to dismissal at any moment for reasons ranging from theft to simple displeasure on the part of her employers. A woman with some education might find work as a governess, though this was precarious employment that could end with a change in the family's circumstances or the ageing of the children in her care. A woman willing to endure the conditions could work in factories, in laundries, in the sweated trades where garments were assembled by the dozen for wages calculated in pennies per piece. But all of these paths required youth, health, and a degree of good fortune that was never guaranteed and rarely sustained. A husband who drank could reduce a household to poverty within months. A husband who died left a widow with no legal claim to whatever small property might have existed, and no means of supporting herself except through her own labour. An employer who made unwanted advances created an impossible situation. Submit and risk pregnancy and certain dismissal, or refuse and face dismissal anyway, this time without a reference that might secure other employment. Illness, injury, simple bad luck. Any of these could begin the descent that ended in the streets of Whitechapel. Some of the women had children living, though not with them. The children had been placed in orphanages, or were being raised by relatives, or had simply disappeared into the vast population of London's poor and could not be found. A woman living in a common lodging house had no means to care for a child. The rooms were shared with strangers, the hours were irregular, the income was unpredictable, and so the children were given up or lost, and became one more weight of grief that the women carried as they walked their nightly rounds. The work itself followed patterns that had been established over years, over generations. Each woman had her territory, a particular stretch of street, a specific corner near a pub or a shop. These territories were generally respected, though disputes occurred when someone new arrived, or when desperation drove a woman to encroach on another's established ground. The hours began in the evening, after the pubs had filled and the men who worked the docks or the markets or the warehouses had been paid their wages. The women positioned themselves where they could be seen, where the gaslight illuminated enough to make recognition possible, but not so much that every detail of age or wear was visible. They wore whatever clothing they possessed that might be considered presentable: a jacket with most of its buttons, a skirt that had been brushed clean, a bonnet that covered hair that might not have been washed in days or weeks. The transaction itself was brief. A few words exchanged, a price agreed upon, generally between threepence and a shilling, depending on what was offered and how desperate either party might be. Then a walk to somewhere darker, somewhere more private. The courts and alleyways served this purpose, as did the staircases in the tenement buildings, or the yards behind the shops when the shops were closed. Some women brought customers back to their lodging houses if the deputy allowed it, or if the deputy could be paid to look the other way. The act itself lasted a few minutes at most. The customer departed. The woman counted her coins and returned to her corner to wait for the next one. There was hierarchy even in this. The younger women, those still in their 20s or early 30s, could command higher prices and had more regular customers. The older women, those past 40, competed for whatever remained. Men too drunk to care about the age or appearance of their partner, men whose own desperation or particular desires led them to those whom others passed by. Some women had regular customers who sought them out specifically, men who knew their names and perhaps treated them with a degree of kindness or at least consistency. But most encounters were anonymous, transactional, marked by neither cruelty nor tenderness, but by a simple exchange of money for access, after which both parties returned to their separate lives as though the meeting had never occurred. The dangers were many and well known. A customer might turn violent, might strike or choke or simply refuse to pay after the act was completed. A customer might rob the woman, taking whatever coins she had earned earlier in the evening. A customer might be diseased, passing along infections that would worsen over time, that would eventually require treatment the women could not afford and would not seek until the symptoms became unbearable. The police were not protectors. An officer might intervene if he witnessed an assault in progress, but more often the police simply moved the women along, told them to keep walking, arrested them if their solicitation was too bold, or if some resident had complained about their presence on a particular street. The women protected themselves as best they could. They learned to assess a customer quickly, the way he walked, the way he spoke, whether he seemed dangerously drunk or merely ordinarily so. They learned which alleys had exits at both ends, which courtyards could be escaped from if necessary. Some carried small knives for protection, though this was risky. A weapon could be turned against its owner, and possession of a knife could result in arrest if a constable chose to search. Mostly they relied on instinct, on years of experience reading men, on the knowledge that while most customers were no more or less than what they appeared to be, some carried intentions that went beyond the simple transaction, and those were the ones to avoid if possible, to endure if avoidance was not an option. The money earned went to immediate necessities. The fourpence for the bed came first. Without shelter, everything else became exponentially more difficult. Then food, though this was often sacrificed in favour of drink. Gin was cheaper than food and provided a warmth, a numbness that made the work bearable. A woman might earn a shilling in an evening, sometimes more, sometimes less. Of this, fourpence went to the lodging house, twopence or threepence went to gin. The remainder, if any remained, might purchase bread or tea or a bit of sugar. There was never enough to save, never enough to imagine a different future. The economics of survival in Whitechapel operated on a day-to-day basis, sometimes an hour-to-hour basis, where the next meal or the next drink or the next bed was the furthest horizon one could reasonably contemplate. In the lodging houses, the women formed loose communities. They shared information about customers, who paid reliably, who became violent, who was known to the police and should be avoided. They sometimes shared clothing or food if they had any to spare. They quarrelled over small matters, a missing item, an imagined slight, the effects of drink that made tempers flare. But they also understood one another in ways that no one outside their circumstances could. They had all travelled the same road, had all made the same series of choices or had the same choices made for them by circumstance. They knew the particular exhaustion of age combined with poverty, the knowledge that their bodies were failing, that each year made the work harder, made customers scarcer, made the distance between survival and complete destitution narrower. Some of the women used false names or changed their names frequently. Some gave different names to different people, one name at the lodging house, another to the police, a third to casual acquaintances. This made them difficult to track, difficult to identify with certainty when identification became necessary. The transient nature of life in Whitechapel contributed to this anonymity. People came and went. A woman might stay at Crossingham's for a month, then move to the White House, then disappear for weeks before returning. The deputies kept rough records of who owed money and who had paid, but beyond this there was little documentation, little official notice. A woman could die and be buried in a pauper's grave with the wrong name on the record, and no one would know or care enough to correct it. The relationship between these women and the rest of Whitechapel society was complex. They were despised and pitied in equal measure. The charitable missions attempted to save them, offering food and shelter in exchange for attendance at prayer meetings, for promises to reform, for submission to the moral instruction that characterized Victorian philanthropy. Some women accepted this help when they were desperate enough, sat through the sermons, ate the soup, slept in the mission beds, and then returned to the streets when the alternative became clear. Permanent residence in the mission meant permanent supervision, meant giving up the gin and the independence, meant living under rules that were often more restrictive than those of the workhouse itself. The other residents of Whitechapel, the labourers, the shopkeepers, the families struggling to maintain respectability despite poverty, existed in uneasy proximity to the women of the streets. They shared the same building sometimes, the same staircases and courtyards. Their children played in the same alleys where the women conducted their business. The line between respectability and ruin was thin enough that many could remember when they themselves, or their mothers or sisters, had been closer to crossing it. There was judgment, certainly, but also recognition that in Whitechapel, no one was so secure that they could afford to condemn too harshly. By August of 1888, a number of women had become familiar fixtures in the nightly landscape of Whitechapel. They were known to the police, to the deputies of the lodging houses, to the publicans who served them. They ranged in age from the late 30s to the middle 50s. They had been on the streets for years, some for decades. They had survived violence before, beatings, robberies, assaults of various kinds. They had been arrested and released, had appeared before magistrates, had spent nights in cells at the police stations. They had buried friends and acquaintances who had died from drink, from disease, from exposure, from the simple accumulated damage of living as they lived. They did not know that history was about to take notice of them. They did not know that their names they had sometimes invented, names that appeared in multiple variations in the scattered records of lodging houses and police courts, would be remembered long after the names of queens and ministers had faded from common knowledge. They knew only the immediate present, the next customer, the next drink, the next bed. They walked the same streets they had walked the night before and would walk the night after. And in the warm darkness of an August evening, with the sounds of the city around them and the gaslights casting their uncertain glow across the cobblestones, they continued the work of surviving, unaware that for some of them, survival was measured now not in years or months, but in days and hours. Chapter 3. The First Blood, Emma Smith. The 3rd of April, in the year 1888, fell on a Tuesday. The weather had been wet for several days, the rain coming in waves across London, turning the streets to mud and filling the gutters with water that ran dark with the accumulated filth of the city. In Whitechapel, where the drainage was poor and the streets had been laid down centuries before any thought was given to modern sanitation, the rain created pools of standing water in the courts and alleyways, pools that reflected the gaslight when the lamps were lit and turned to ice when the temperature dropped after midnight. Emma Elizabeth Smith was 45 years old. She lived, when she had the money for it, at 18 George Street in Spitalfields, in a common lodging house managed by a deputy whose name was recorded in some documents as Mary Russell. The house stood in a row of similar buildings, brick structures 3 or 4 stories tall, their windows giving onto a street that was narrow even by the standards of the East End. Emma Smith had lived at number 18 for some time, months at least, possibly longer. She was known to the other residents, known to the deputy, known to the constables who walked the beat in that district. She was described later as a widow, though whether she had actually been married was uncertain. She had a son, she told people, who was alive somewhere, though she had not seen him in years and could not say where he might be found. She was not from London originally. Her accent suggested the West Country, and she claimed at various times to have lived in different parts of England before coming to the capital. What had brought her to London, what sequence of events had led her to the lodging house on George Street, was known only to herself, and perhaps not completely even to her. The stories that women told about their pasts were often incomplete, often shaped by what they wanted their listeners to believe or what they themselves could bear to remember. Emma Smith's past was like her present, a matter of fragments, of details that appeared in one telling and vanished in another, of a life that had contracted to the immediate and the necessary. She had been on the streets for a considerable time. The deputies of the lodging houses knew her trade, as did the police. She was not a woman who caused trouble. She paid her doss when she had it. She drank, but no more than most. She was civil to the other lodgers, caused no disturbances that would attract the attention of the authorities. In the hierarchy of the lodging house, She was unremarkable, neither the youngest nor the oldest, neither particularly successful nor particularly desperate. She was simply one of dozens of women who lived in the houses along George Street and the surrounding district, who walked the streets at night, who survived from one day to the next by whatever means were available. On the evening of the 2nd of April, which was a Monday, Emma Smith left the lodging house at some hour that was not precisely recorded. She was seen later that evening in the vicinity of Whitechapel, though the exact locations and times were matters of conflicting testimony. What is known is that she did not return to George Street that night. The bed she normally occupied remained empty. The deputy made note of this, but it was not unusual. Lodgers frequently stayed out all night, or found shelter elsewhere, or simply could not raise the fourpence necessary for a bed and spent the night on the streets. The following day, the 3rd of April, was when the deputy saw her again. Emma Smith appeared at the lodging house in the early morning hours after daybreak, but before the normal traffic of the day had fully begun. She was injured. Her face bore marks of violence, bruising, swelling, evidence of having been struck. She was bleeding. The nature and extent of her injuries were not immediately apparent, but it was clear that she had been severely harmed. She was able to speak. She told the deputy, and later told others, that she had been attacked. The attack had occurred in the vicinity of Osborne Street, she said, near the corner where Osborne Street met Brick Lane. She had been returning from Whitechapel, walking alone when she had been set upon by men. She said there were 3 or 4 of them, though she was not certain of the exact number. Young men, she thought, though in the darkness and in the confusion of the attack she had not been able to see them clearly. One of them had struck her in the mouth. They had robbed her, taking what money she had, and they had done something else, something she did not describe in detail, something that had caused the bleeding that was now visible on her clothing. The deputy recognised that the situation required medical attention. Emma Smith was taken, or went with assistance, to the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road. The hospital stood approximately a mile from George Street, a substantial building that served the poor of the East End, where treatment was provided without charge to those who could not pay. She arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock in the morning on April 3rd. She was examined by the house surgeon, a man whose name was later recorded as George Haslip. The examination revealed injuries that were severe and specific. She had been beaten about the face and head. The ear was torn, but the most serious injury was internal. She had been penetrated violently with some object, not, the doctor determined, in the course of a sexual assault by a man, but with an instrument of some kind, something that had been forced into her body with enough violence to cause internal rupturing. The damage was catastrophic. The doctor recognised immediately that the injury was potentially fatal, that peritonitis, the infection that resulted from such internal damage, would almost certainly develop, and that there was little that could be done to prevent it once it had begun. Emma Smith remained in the hospital. The doctors treated her as best they could with the medical knowledge available in 1888, which meant cleaning the wounds, administering what pain relief could be offered, and watching for the signs of infection that would indicate whether she would survive. She was questioned about the attack. She repeated the story she had told at the lodging house. Men, 3 or 4 of them, young near Osborne Street. She could provide no better description. She had not seen their faces clearly. She did not know their names or where they had gone after the attack. The police were notified. The responsibility for investigating crimes in the Whitechapel area fell to H Division of the Metropolitan Police, headquartered at Leman Street. The officers who took the initial report noted the circumstances. A woman attacked and robbed, seriously injured, possibly by a gang of youths. This was not an unusual occurrence. Robberies happened regularly in the East End, and violence accompanied them with depressing frequency. The police made note of the location, took down what details Emma Smith could provide, and began what investigation was possible given the lack of useful information. They walked the route she described. They made inquiries in the area. They found no witnesses, no one who had seen the attack or could identify the men responsible. Emma Smith's condition worsened over the following day. The infection the doctors had anticipated began to manifest. Fever set in. The internal damage was too severe, the medical intervention too limited. On the 4th of April, 2 days after the attack, Emma Elizabeth Smith died in the London hospital. She was 45 years old. The cause of death was recorded as peritonitis resulting from injuries sustained during a violent assault. An inquest was held, as was required by law in cases of violent death. The coroner for the district, a man named Wynne Baxter, convened the proceedings. The witnesses included the deputy from the lodging house, the doctor who had treated Emma Smith at the hospital, and the police officers who had investigated the case. The testimony established the basic facts: the attack, the injuries, the death. Emma Smith's own statements given before she died were entered into the record. She had been attacked by men near Osborne Street. She had been robbed. She had been injured in a manner that had caused her death. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown. This was the standard verdict when the perpetrators could not be identified. It meant that the crime was acknowledged, that the death was not accidental, but that there was insufficient evidence to charge any specific individual. The police continued their inquiries for a time, but without witnesses and without any useful description of the attackers, there was little they could do. The case remained open in the official sense, but practically speaking, it was unsolved and likely to remain so. Emma Smith was buried in a pauper's grave in the East London cemetery. No family came forward to claim her body or to pay for a private burial. Her son, if he existed, did not appear. The lodging house cleared out her few possessions, such as they were, and rented her bed to the next person who needed it. Within days, her death had been forgotten by everyone except those who had known her personally, and even they had their own survival to attend to and little time or energy to spend on mourning. The police did not classify Emma Smith's death as part of any particular pattern. She had been killed by a gang, or so she had said, by multiple attackers acting together. This was different from the usual run of murders in Whitechapel, which tended to involve individual perpetrators, husbands killing wives, men killing other men in quarrels over money or drink, the occasional robbery that turned fatal. A gang attack was troubling, but it was also explainable. Gangs of young men did operate in the East End, did rob and assault people, particularly those who were vulnerable and alone. The injury Emma Smith had sustained was unusual in its specific nature, but violence against women who worked the streets was common enough that one more death, however brutal, did not immediately suggest anything beyond the ordinary cruelty of which men were capable. And so, the spring progressed. April turned to May, May to June, June to July. The weather warmed, the streets dried. Life in Whitechapel continued as it always had. People working, drinking, struggling, surviving. The women walked their corners as they had walked them before Emma Smith's death, and would walk them after. The police patrolled their beats. The lodging houses filled each night with those who had scraped together the price of a bed. And Emma Elizabeth Smith's name faded from the records, noted only in the coroner's files and the police reports, one death among thousands in a city that counted its poor by the hundreds of thousands, and counted their deaths as unremarkable. But history would return to her. In the months that followed, when other women died and the pattern became clear, investigators would look back and wonder whether Emma Smith's death had been the beginning, whether the men who attacked her near Osborne Street had been practicing for what came later, whether the violence done to her body had been an early expression of the particular horror that would soon consume Whitechapel. The questions would remain unanswered. Emma Smith had died before she could provide better information about her attackers. The police had found nothing, and so her death remained ambiguous, classified sometimes as the first of the Whitechapel murders, sometimes as separate, unconnected, a tragedy that merely preceded the greater tragedy without being part of it. What is certain is that she was the first to die in that particular way, in that particular year, in that particular district. She was the first whose death would later be examined for connections to what followed, and she was the first to vanish into a pauper's grave while the city that had killed her continued onward, indifferent, unknowing, unprepared for the autumn that was coming. Chapter 4, the 7th of August. The heat had returned by August. After the wet spring and the variable weather of early summer, the temperature rose and settled over London like a thick blanket, making the air in the narrow streets of Whitechapel difficult to breathe. The smells of the city intensified. The horse manure that accumulated in the roadways, the refuse that piled in the courts, the unwashed bodies crowded into rooms where the windows, if there were windows, remained closed against the flies that bred in every available surface. At night the heat persisted, making sleep difficult for those fortunate enough to have beds, and impossible for those who spent the hours of darkness on the streets. Martha Tabram was 39 years old. She had been born Martha White in the Suffolk district of London in 1849, though some records suggested different names, different dates, different origins. Such discrepancies were common among the poor, whose births were sometimes not registered, whose marriages were informal, whose names changed with circumstances or simply with the telling. She had been married legally to a man named Henry Samuel Tabram, a foreman at a furniture warehouse. The marriage had produced 2 sons. For a time she had lived in the northern suburbs of London, in places like Stamford Hill, where the streets were wider and the air cleaner than in the East End. But the marriage had deteriorated. Henry Tabram later testified that his wife drank heavily, that her drinking had made domestic life impossible, that he had separated from her in 1875 and had paid her an allowance of 12 shillings per week until he discovered that she was living with another man, at which point he stopped the payments. Martha Tabram's version of events, if she ever provided one, was not recorded. What is known is that by the 1880s she was living in the East End, that she had taken up with a man named Henry Turner, who worked as a carpenter, and that she lived sometimes with Turner and sometimes in the common lodging houses when Turner was away at work or when their relationship, which was tempestuous, had reached one of its periodic breaking points. By August of 1888, Martha Tabram was living at 19 George Street, in a lodging house that stood only a few doors away from where Emma Smith had lived before her death in April. The deputy of the house knew her as Emma Turner, the surname taken from the man with whom she lived. She paid for her bed when she had money. When she did not have money, she slept elsewhere or did not sleep. She drank gin when she could afford it. She walked the streets when she needed to earn money. She was known to the police, known to the other lodgers, known to the publicans of the nearby pubs. She was, in all respects, ordinary, one more middle-aged woman among thousands, living day to day, attracting no particular notice, leaving no particular mark. The 6th of August was a Monday, a bank holiday. The East End had its own way of observing such days, which meant that those who normally worked had the day free, and those who never worked continued as they always had. The pubs were full from early in the day. Martha Tabram spent the afternoon and evening drinking, first with Henry Turner, later with another woman named Mary Ann Connolly, who was known among the lodgers as Pearly Pole. The 2 women made their way from pub to pub, drinking gin and beer, spending whatever money they had or could acquire. As the evening progressed, they encountered 2 soldiers. The soldiers were guardsmen, stationed at the Tower of London or at Wellington Barracks, both of which were within walking distance of Whitechapel. The soldiers were young, in uniform or in the clothing that soldiers wore when off duty. One was a corporal, identifiable by his stripes. The other was a private. They joined the women, paid for drinks, and the 4 of them continued together through the evening, moving from pub to pub, the Whitechapel Road area offering an abundance of establishments that would serve them. The evening wore on. The pubs closed at their appointed hours, emptying their customers into the streets. Martha Tabram and Pearly Pole separated from one another, each taking one of the soldiers, the understanding being that they would conduct whatever business had been agreed upon, and then part ways. Pearly Pole later testified that she had gone with the private into Angel Alley, that the transaction had been completed, that she had last seen Martha Tabram at approximately 11:30, walking with the corporal in the direction of George Yard. George Yard was a narrow passage that ran between Whitechapel High Street and Wentworth Street. It was perhaps 100 yards long, lined on both sides by tenement buildings that rose 4 and 5 stories, their facades blackened by coal smoke and time. The yard was paved with cobblestones, worn smooth in places, broken in others. Midway along its length stood George Yard Buildings, a tenement block containing perhaps 30 or 40 small flats, accessed by a central staircase that rose from the ground floor to the upper levels. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of August, a resident of George Yard Buildings named Alfred George Crow returned home from his work. He was a cab driver, and his hours were irregular. He entered the building, began climbing the stairs to his flat on one of the upper floors, and in the dim light that filtered in from the street he saw something on the landing between the 1st and 2nd floors. It appeared to be a person lying down. This was not entirely unusual. People sometimes slept on the landings when they were drunk or when they had no other place to go. Crow assumed it was someone sleeping off the effects of drink. He did not investigate closely. He continued to his flat and went to bed. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, another resident named John Saunders Reeves descended the same staircase on his way to work at the docks. Reeves saw the same figure on the landing. In the growing daylight that now came through the windows, he could see more clearly. It was a woman. She was lying on her back. There was blood. Reeves went for help. He found a constable, Police Constable 226H Thomas Barrett, who was on his beat nearby. Barrett came to the building and examined the body. The woman was dead. She had been stabbed repeatedly. The blood had pooled around her and had run down the stairs. Her clothing was disarranged but not removed. Her hands lay by her sides. Her eyes were open. The police machinery began its work. More constables arrived. The doctor was summoned, Dr. Timothy Killeen, who lived nearby and served as a police surgeon for the district. The scene was examined, though the science of crime scene investigation in 1888 was primitive. There were no photographs taken. The body was not left in place for detailed study. Dr. Killeen conducted a preliminary examination there on the landing, noting the wounds, the position of the body, the state of the clothing. Then the body was removed to the mortuary at Old Montague Street, where a more thorough examination could be conducted. The mortuary was a brick building, small and poorly ventilated, where bodies awaiting inquest were stored on wooden boards or in rough coffins. Dr. Killeen examined Martha Tabram's body in detail, counting the wounds, noting their locations and characteristics. The findings were documented in his report and later presented at the inquest. The woman had been stabbed 39 times. The wounds were concentrated on the torso, on the breasts and abdomen, though some were on the lower body and a few on the neck. The majority of the wounds appeared to have been inflicted with a single weapon, something like a penknife or similar blade. But one wound, a single puncture to the sternum, appeared different, deeper, made with a stronger weapon, possibly a dagger or bayonet. The ferocity of the attack was evident. 39 separate wounds meant the killer had continued stabbing long after death had occurred. The pattern suggested rage, or frenzy, or some particular fixation on the act of penetrating the body. The location of the wounds on the breasts and abdomen suggested a sexual element, though there was no evidence of actual sexual assault in the conventional sense. The victim's clothing had been disturbed but not removed. The wounds themselves seemed to be the point, the repeated penetration of the blade into flesh. The identity of the victim was initially uncertain. She carried no identification. Her clothing offered no clues. The police made inquiries in the area, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything during the night. A woman came forward who claimed to have heard a cry of murder at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, but she had not investigated and could provide no additional information. Other residents of George Yard buildings were questioned. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had seen anyone suspicious entering or leaving the building. Eventually, someone recognized the body. The deputy of the lodging house at 19 George Street identified her as Emma Turner, the woman who had been staying there. From there, the police were able to trace her actual name, Martha Tabram. They located Henry Turner, who confirmed the identification. They found her estranged husband, Henry Tabram, who also identified her. The pieces of her life were assembled through these interviews, though many details remained unclear or contradictory. The search for witnesses led police to Pearlie Pole, who had been with Martha Tabram earlier in the evening. She told her story, the pubs, the soldiers, the separation at 11:30. The police immediately focused on the soldiers. If Martha Tabram had gone with one of them, and if she had been killed shortly after, then the soldier was the obvious suspect. But identifying which soldiers had been in Whitechapel that night proved difficult. The Tower of London housed hundreds of soldiers. The Guards regiments rotated duties and postings regularly. The description Pearlie Pole provided was vague. One corporal, one private, both in uniform or partial uniform, both drinking heavily. The police arranged identification parades. Soldiers from the Tower and from Wellington Barracks were assembled in lines while Pearlie Pole walked past, trying to identify the men she had seen. She picked out several different men on different occasions, then changed her identifications, then became uncertain. The soldiers themselves were questioned. Some admitted to having been in Whitechapel that evening. Some had alibis. None admitted to having been with Martha Tabram. The investigation stalled. The inquest was held at the Working Lads Institute on Whitechapel Road. The coroner, George Collier, presided over the proceedings. The witnesses testified, The residents who had found the body, Dr. Killeen who had examined it, the police who had investigated, Pearlie Pole with her uncertain identifications, Henry Turner with his account of his relationship with the deceased. The jury viewed the body. They heard the evidence. They returned a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown. The case remained open, but without leads. The police continued to question soldiers, but without a reliable identification and without any physical evidence connecting anyone to the crime, there was nothing to pursue. The weapon was never found. The killer was never identified. Martha Tabram was buried in a pauper's grave in Manor Park Cemetery. Henry Turner attended the funeral. A few other people came, acquaintances from the lodging houses, people who had known her slightly. Then she was forgotten, as Emma Smith had been forgotten, as all the forgotten dead of Whitechapel were forgotten. Except that history had already begun to notice. 2 women dead within 4 months, both residents of George Street, both killed violently, both dying from wounds that spoke of particular brutality. The police did not yet see a connection. The circumstances seemed different. Emma Smith killed by a gang, Martha Tabram apparently killed by a single assailant. But the geography was the same. The victims were the same type. Middle-aged women working the streets, and August had only just begun. The summer was not yet over, and the pattern, though still incomplete, was beginning to form in the dark spaces of Whitechapel, where the old streets held their secrets, and the gaslights cast shadows that moved like living things across the ancient stones. Chapter 5. The Inquest. The Working Lads Institute stood on Whitechapel Road, a brick building erected with charitable funds for the purpose of providing education and moral improvement to the young men of the East End. It contained a reading room, a meeting hall, and spaces where lectures could be delivered on subjects ranging from temperance to industrial training. But the building also served another function, one less edifying than its founders had intended. The meeting hall was used periodically as a coroner's court, where inquests into sudden or violent deaths were held before juries composed of local residents who were required by law to view the bodies of the deceased and to render verdicts on the causes of death. The inquest into the death of Martha Tabram opened on the 9th of August, 2 days after her body had been discovered on the landing of George Yard buildings. The coroner was George Collier, a solicitor by profession who had held the position of coroner for the southeastern district of Middlesex for a number of years. He was a man accustomed to violent death, accustomed to the particular varieties of tragedy that characterised the East End, deaths from drink, from disease, from industrial accidents, from domestic violence, from simple poverty and exposure. But even by these standards, the death of Martha Tabram was notable for its brutality. The courtroom filled early. The jury had been summoned and sworn. 14 men drawn from the vicinity, tradesmen and labourers for the most part, men who knew Whitechapel as the place where they lived and worked. The law required that they view the body before the inquest could properly begin, and so they were taken first to the mortuary on Old Montague Street, where Martha Tabram lay on a wooden board in the dim light that came through the high windows. The body had been washed, but not prepared for burial. The wounds were visible, the extent of them clear even to untrained eyes. The jurors looked, some longer than others, some turning away quickly, all of them understanding that they were seeing something beyond the ordinary run of deaths they might be called upon to judge. They returned to the Working Lads Institute and took their seats. The coroner called the first witness. The process of an inquest followed established patterns. The identity of the deceased had to be confirmed. The circumstances of death had to be established through witness testimony. Medical evidence had to be presented. The police had to report on their investigation. Then the jury would retire to consider their verdict. Though, in cases of obvious murder where the perpetrator was unknown, the verdict was generally a formality, willful murder against person or persons unknown, which left the case open for further police investigation, but acknowledged that the jury itself could not identify the guilty party. Henry Samuel Tabram was called first to identify the body as that of his estranged wife. He was a man in his 40s, respectably employed, living in East Greenwich where he had moved after the separation. He testified that he'd been married to Martha Tabram for approximately 13 years, that they had separated in 1875, that he had paid her an allowance until he discovered she was living with another man. He had not seen her in recent years. He identified her body at the mortuary. He could provide no information about the circumstances of her death. The coroner thanked him and dismissed him. Henry Turner was called next. He was younger than Tabram, a carpenter by trade, living sometimes in Whitechapel and sometimes in other parts of London, depending on where his work took him. He testified that he had been living with Martha Tabram, whom he knew as Martha Turner, on and off for approximately 9 years. They had lived together most recently at 4 Star Place, off Commercial Road, but had separated about 3 weeks before her death due to his inability to support her financially. He had last seen her on the Saturday before her death, in Leadenhall Street, where they had spoken briefly. She had appeared well. He knew nothing of what had happened to her on the night of the 6th and 7th of August. He had identified her body at the mortuary. He wept as he gave this testimony, though whether from grief or from the stress of appearing before the court was impossible to determine. Mary Ann Connolly, known as Pearly Pole, was called. She was a woman of similar age and circumstances to the deceased, and she had been the last person to see Martha Tabram alive apart from whoever had killed her. She testified that she and Martha had spent the evening of the 6th of August drinking together, that they had met 2 soldiers, that they had gone with the soldiers to various public houses. She described the soldiers, one a corporal with stripes on his uniform, the other a private. She said they had separated at approximately 11:30, she going with one soldier into Angel Alley, Martha going with the other in the direction of George Yard. She had not seen Martha after that. She had heard nothing of the murder until the police came to question her. The coroner asked about the soldiers. Could she describe them more specifically? She could not with any precision. It had been dark. She had been drinking. They were both fairly tall, she thought. One had a white band on his cap, she thought. Or perhaps not. She had attended identification parades at the Tower of London, she said, and had picked out various men, but she could not be certain. Under further questioning, she admitted that her identifications had been uncertain, that she had changed her mind, that she could not swear with confidence that any particular soldier was the one she had seen with Martha Tabram. The coroner made note of this. The uncertainty of witness identification was a common problem in criminal investigations, particularly when the witnesses themselves were of questionable reliability, intoxicated at the time of the events they were describing, members of a class that the law generally viewed with suspicion, motivated perhaps by a desire to avoid their own involvement or to please the police by providing whatever information seemed to be wanted. Pearly Pole's testimony established that Martha Tabram had been with a soldier on the night of her death, but it could not establish which soldier, and therefore could not point the investigation toward any specific suspect. The residents of George Yard buildings were called in turn. Alfred George Crowe testified that he had returned home at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning and had seen what he thought was a person sleeping on the landing. He had not examined it closely. He had simply gone to his flat. John Saunders Reeves testified that he had found the body at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning when he descended the stairs on his way to work. He had immediately sought out a constable. A woman named Elizabeth Mahoney testified that she lived in George Yard buildings and had returned home at approximately 20 minutes to 2 on the morning of the 7th. She had climbed the stairs and had noticed nothing unusual on the landing. This testimony was significant because it suggested that the murder had occurred between 20 minutes to 2, when Mahoney had passed the landing and seen nothing, and 2 o'clock, when Crowe had seen what he thought was a sleeping person. A window of approximately 20 minutes for the murder itself. Police Constable Thomas Barrett testified that he had been on duty in the vicinity of George Yard on the night in question. He had been called to the scene at approximately 5 o'clock by Reeves. He had examined the body and had immediately sent for the doctor and for additional police assistance. He had noted that the body was still slightly warm, though rigor mortis had begun to set in. He had observed the blood on the stairs and the extensive wounds on the body. He had seen a soldier in Wentworth Street earlier in the night, between 2 and 3 o'clock, standing at the corner near George Yard. He had spoken to the soldier, asking what he was doing there. The soldier had replied that he was waiting for a chum who had gone off with a girl. Barrett had seen nothing suspicious and had continued his patrol. This testimony caused considerable interest. A soldier waiting near George Yard at approximately the time when the murder would have been committed. But Barrett had taken no particular notice of the soldier, had not asked his name or his regiment, had not thought the encounter significant at the time. Now, days later, he could provide only the vaguest description. A soldier, a private, he thought, though he could not be certain of the rank. The soldier had appeared sober, had not seemed agitated or blood-stained. Barrett had seen him only briefly in the gaslight before moving on. Dr. Timothy Killeen was called to provide medical testimony. He was sworn and took his place before the coroner. He had been summoned to George Yard Buildings at approximately 5:30 on the morning of the 7th of August, he testified. He had examined the body on the landing where it lay. The woman was dead, had been dead for perhaps 3 hours at that point. The body was still slightly warm. Rigor mortis was commencing. He had noted the extensive wounds and had ordered the body removed to the mortuary for detailed examination. At the mortuary, he had conducted a thorough post-mortem. The deceased was a woman of approximately 35 to 40 years of age. She was poorly nourished but not emaciated. There were no signs of disease that would have contributed to death. The cause of death was clear. She had been stabbed 39 times. Dr. Killeen described the wounds in detail, location by location, organ by organ. The breasts had been penetrated multiple times. The abdomen bore numerous wounds, some of them deep enough to have penetrated the liver, the spleen, the stomach. The lower abdomen and the area of the genitals had been stabbed. The neck bore several wounds, though none had severed the major blood vessels. The coroner asked about the weapon or weapons used. Dr. Killeen stated that the majority of the wounds appeared to have been made with a penknife or similar instrument, a blade perhaps 3 to 4 inches long, not particularly wide, capable of inflicting puncture wounds but not large gashes. However, one wound was different. A single stab to the sternum, the breastbone, had been made with a much stronger weapon, something like a dagger or possibly a bayonet. This wound had penetrated the bone itself, which required considerable force and a blade designed for such penetration. This testimony suggested that 2 weapons had been used, or that the killer had access to more than one type of blade. The penknife wounds were consistent with something a civilian might carry. The bayonet wound suggested military weaponry. Combined with the testimony about the soldiers, this seemed to point toward a soldier as the likely perpetrator. But Dr. Killeen cautioned against certainty. The wounds were difficult to analyse with precision. It was possible that a single strong blow with a different part of the same weapon might account for the variation. He could not state definitively that 2 separate weapons had been employed. The coroner asked about the sequence of the wounds. Could the doctor determine which had been inflicted first? Dr. Killeen said he could not. The wounds had been inflicted in rapid succession, probably within a matter of minutes. Some had been delivered while the victim was still alive and bleeding. Others appeared to have been inflicted after death had occurred or was occurring. The sheer number of wounds suggested a frenzied attack, continued well beyond the point necessary to cause death. Was there evidence of sexual assault? The coroner asked this carefully, aware that such details were disturbing to contemplate and difficult to discuss in the formal setting of an inquest. Dr. Killeen stated that there was no evidence of forcible connection in the conventional sense. The wounds to the lower body and genital area appeared to be part of the general stabbing attack rather than evidence of sexual penetration by the killer. However, the focus of the attack on the breasts and abdomen, the intimate nature of stabbing these particular areas of a woman's body, suggested a sexual element to the violence even if actual rape had not occurred. Inspector Reid of H Division gave testimony regarding the police investigation. He and his men had made extensive inquiries in the area. They had questioned residents of George Yard Buildings and neighbouring properties. They had searched for the weapon but had not found it. They had conducted identification parades with soldiers from various regiments. They had questioned soldiers who admitted to being in Whitechapel on the night in question. None of these inquiries had produced a suspect they could charge with confidence. The investigation was ongoing, but Reid acknowledged that without better witness identification and without the murder weapon, the prospects of solving the case were limited. The coroner summed up the evidence for the jury. A woman had been brutally murdered, stabbed dozens of times, on the landing of a building in the heart of Whitechapel. She had been seen earlier in the evening with a soldier. A soldier had been observed near the scene at approximately the time of the murder. The wounds suggested either military weaponry or at minimum a weapon consistent with military equipment. But no specific soldier had been identified. No weapon had been found. No witness could positively connect any individual to the crime. The jury retired briefly to consider their verdict. When they returned, the foreman announced their conclusion: willful murder against person or persons unknown. It was the only verdict possible given the evidence. The inquest was concluded. The body was released for burial. The newspapers carried brief accounts of the proceedings. Another murder in Whitechapel, another unfortunate woman dead, another case unlikely to be solved. The pattern that was forming remained invisible to most observers. 2 women dead within 4 months, both from the same street, both killed with extreme violence. The police noted it, certainly. Inspector Reid and his colleagues were aware that Emma Smith and Martha Tabram represented an unusual concentration of violent death, even by Whitechapel standards. But the circumstances seemed different enough that connecting them into a single pattern was not yet justified. Emma Smith had been killed by multiple attackers. Martha Tabram apparently by a single man, possibly a soldier. The methods were different. The motives, if such violence could be said to have rational motives, appeared different. And so the inquest ended, the verdict was recorded, the body was buried, and Whitechapel continued. The lodging houses filled each night. The women walked their corners. The soldiers drank in the pubs and sought companionship in the dark alleys. The police walked their beats, watching for crimes they could prevent or interrupt, investigating crimes that had already occurred, maintaining what order was possible in a district where poverty and desperation made order a fragile and temporary thing. August moved toward its end. The heat persisted, day after day of cloudless skies and stifling air that made the streets of Whitechapel feel like a furnace lined with brick and stone. And somewhere in those streets, in the lodging houses or the pubs or the anonymous rooms where the city's poor made their temporary homes, a killer moved unrecognized, unidentified, preparing perhaps for what would come next, or perhaps not preparing at all, perhaps simply waiting for opportunity, for darkness, for another woman alone in another alley where the gaslights could not reach, and where screams, if there were screams, would be ignored by those who heard them as just one more sound in the endless night of the East End. Chapter 6. The Machinery of Investigation. The Metropolitan Police Force in the year 1888 was an organisation approximately 60 years old, created by Act of Parliament in 1829 under the guidance of Home Secretary Robert Peel, from whom the officers derived their informal names, Peelers or Bobbies. The force had grown substantially since its founding, expanding to cover the entire metropolitan area of London with the exception of the City of London proper, which maintained its own separate police force. By 1888, the Metropolitan Police employed approximately 15,000 men, divided into divisions that corresponded to the geographic districts of the city. H Division covered Whitechapel and the surrounding areas of the East End. The divisional headquarters stood on Leman Street, a substantial brick building that housed the administrative offices, the cells where prisoners were held awaiting transfer to court, and the muster rooms where constables received their assignments before beginning their beats. The division was commanded by a superintendent with inspectors below him, responsible for different aspects of operations, and below them the sergeants and constables who did the actual work of patrolling the streets, investigating crimes and maintaining public order. Inspector Edmund John James Reid was one of the senior officers in H Division in the summer of 1888. He was a man in his early 40s, having joined the police force as a young man and risen through the ranks by competence and diligence. He had a reputation as a capable investigator, methodical in his approach, thorough in his questioning of witnesses, persistent in following whatever leads an investigation might produce. He had handled numerous murder cases during his career, though most had been of the straightforward variety. Domestic killings where the perpetrator was obvious, fights that had escalated to fatal violence, robberies gone wrong. The murder of Martha Tabram presented difficulties that these earlier cases had not. The investigation had begun, as all such investigations began at the scene itself. Reid had arrived at George Yard Buildings on the morning of the 7th of August, shortly after the body had been discovered. He had examined the landing where Martha Tabram lay, noting the position of the body, the amount of blood, the wounds visible even through the clothing. He had questioned the constable who had first responded, had questioned the man who had found the body, had ordered a search of the immediate area for any physical evidence that might prove useful, the weapon, blood-stained clothing, anything that the killer might have discarded in flight. The search had produced nothing of value. The stairwell in the yard outside had been traversed by numerous people in the hours since the murder. Any footprints or traces that might have existed had been obliterated. The weapon was not found in the building or in the immediate vicinity. The killer had either taken it with him or had disposed of it somewhere else. somewhere the police could not determine without better information about his movements and identity. The next step was to establish the identity of the victim. This had been accomplished through the lodging house deputy and through the testimony of Henry Turner and Henry Tabram. With the identity established, Reid could begin to reconstruct Martha Tabram's movements on the night of her death. This meant finding and questioning anyone who had seen her, anyone who had been with her, anyone who might know where she had gone and with whom. The investigation led to Pearlie Pole, who provided the crucial information about the soldiers. This opened a new line of inquiry. If Martha Tabram had been with a soldier, if she had been killed by a soldier, then the investigation needed to focus on identifying which soldier and establishing his movements. Reid requested assistance from the military authorities. The Tower of London and Wellington barracks were contacted. Lists were compiled of soldiers who had been granted leave on the night of the 6th and 7th of August. These men were identified and brought in for questioning. The questioning followed a pattern. Each soldier was asked where he had been on the night in question. Those who admitted to having been in Whitechapel were asked for details, which pubs they had visited, whether they had been alone or with companions, whether they had encountered women, whether they had paid for the company of women. Some admitted freely to having been with prostitutes. This was not a crime in itself, and the soldiers knew that lying to police investigators was more dangerous than admitting to moral lapses. Others denied having been in Whitechapel at all, claiming to have been at the barracks or at other locations. Each alibi had to be checked, each statement verified or disproven through additional questioning of other soldiers, of publicans, of anyone who might confirm or contradict the testimony. The identification parades were arranged. Pearlie Pole was brought to the Tower, where groups of soldiers were assembled in lines, and she was asked to walk past them and point out any she recognised. She had identified several men on different occasions, but her identifications had been inconsistent. She had pointed to one man, then later said she was not certain. She had failed to identify the same man on a subsequent parade. She had identified different men from different regiments, which was impossible if the two soldiers she had seen on the night in question had been together as she claimed. Reid recognised the problem. Witness identification was notoriously unreliable, particularly when the witness was of questionable character, had been drinking at the time of the events being recalled, and was being asked to remember faces seen briefly and in poor light days or weeks earlier. Pearlie Pole's identifications were worthless as evidence that could be presented in court. Even if she had confidently identified a specific soldier, the defence would tear her testimony apart in cross-examination. And without her confident identification, there was no way to connect any particular soldier to Martha Tabram's death. The weapon evidence was similarly frustrating. Dr. Killeen's testimony about the wounds suggested two different types of blades, one possibly a bayonet. The police made inquiries about bayonets. Were any missing from the Tower or from Wellington barracks? Had any soldiers been seen with bayonets when they should not have had them? The military authorities checked their inventories. All bayonets were accounted for. No irregularities were reported. This meant either that the weapon used was not a military bayonet, or that it had been returned to its proper place after the murder, or that the inventory records were incomplete or inaccurate. Reid expanded the investigation beyond the immediate question of the soldiers. He assigned constables to canvass the area around George Yard, knocking on doors, questioning residents, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night of the 6th and 7th. The responses were largely unhelpful. Some people had been asleep. Some had heard noises but had thought nothing of it. Whitechapel was full of noises at night, shouts and arguments and the sounds of people moving through the streets. One woman reported having heard a cry of murder at approximately 3 o'clock, but she lived some distance from George Yard and could not be certain of the time or the location. She had not looked out her window. She had not reported it to police at the time. The investigation also required Reid to consider whether Martha Tabram's death was connected to the death of Emma Smith 4 months earlier. Both women had lived on George Street. Both had been killed violently. Both had been engaged in prostitution. But the circumstances seemed different. Emma Smith had described multiple attackers. Martha Tabram appeared to have been killed by a single person. Emma Smith had been penetrated with an object that had caused fatal internal injuries. Martha Tabram had been stabbed repeatedly with a knife or knives. The geographical proximity and the similarity of the victim's circumstances were notable, but Reid could not determine whether this represented a meaningful pattern or simply a coincidence. two separate incidents in a district where violence against poor women was unfortunately common. The resources available to Reid were limited by the standards of later eras. There was no criminal database to search for similar crimes. There were no forensic laboratories that could analyse blood or other physical evidence. There were no fingerprint records. The technique of fingerprint identification existed but was not yet in use by British police. There was no photography of crime scenes as a matter of routine. The investigation depended on witnesses, on confessions, on catching the criminal in the act, or through information provided by those who knew him. Reid kept detailed notes. The statements of witnesses were written down and filed. The results of the identification parades were recorded. The alibis of questioned soldiers were documented. The case file grew thicker as the investigation continued, but it contained no breakthrough, no piece of evidence that pointed definitively toward a suspect who could be charged and prosecuted. The investigation was thorough within the limitations of its time, but thoroughness could not create evidence where none existed. As August progressed, the intensity of the investigation began to diminish. Other crimes required attention. Other murders occurred. Whitechapel and the East End were not lacking in violence, and H Division's resources had to be distributed across all the incidents that required police response. The Martha Tabram case remained open, but the active daily work of pursuing leads gradually gave way to periodic reviews of the file, to occasional follow-up questions when new information emerged, to the slow acknowledgement that without a witness who could reliably identify the killer, or without a confession from someone with knowledge of the crime, the murder would likely remain unsolved. The newspapers had covered the case, though not extensively. The murder was reported, the inquest proceedings were summarised, and then the story faded from the pages as newer events took its place. The East London Advertiser and the East London Observer gave it more attention than the West End papers, but even in the local press, the death of Martha Tabram was one item among many in the ongoing chronicle of East End misery. A woman had been killed. The police were investigating. No arrest had been made. These facts were noted and then superseded by other news: strikes, political debates, fires, accidents, the endless succession of events that filled the columns and gave readers their daily information about the world. Inspector Reid had no way of knowing that the case he was investigating was not yet complete, that Martha Tabram's death was not an isolated incident but part of a sequence that had already begun and would continue. He had no reason to suspect that the ordinary-seeming murder of an ordinary-seeming woman would, within a matter of weeks, be retrospectively examined as potentially the first in a series that would become the most famous unsolved crimes in the history of criminal investigation. He simply did his work, followed his procedures, documented what could be documented, and moved on to the next case when it became clear that this one had reached the limits of what investigation could achieve. The machinery of investigation in 1888 was a human machinery. Constables walking beats, inspectors asking questions, witnesses providing uncertain testimony, doctors examining bodies with the limited medical knowledge available, juries rendering verdicts based on incomplete evidence. It was a system that solved many crimes, particularly those where the criminal was known to the victim or where witnesses had seen the crime occur. But for crimes like Martha Tabram's murder, where the killer was a stranger, where the encounter had been brief and in darkness, where the victim could not speak and the witnesses could not identify, the machinery ground slowly and often produced no result except the accumulation of files and the grim acknowledgement that some deaths would never be avenged. And so the investigation continued in its reduced form, a file in a cabinet at Leman Street, a name in the unsolved records, a memory in the minds of those who had known Martha Tabram and those who had tried to find her killer. The streets of Whitechapel remained dark at night. The women continued to walk. The lodging houses filled and emptied according to their nightly rhythm, and the city, ancient and vast and indifferent, absorbed one more death into its long history of violence, making no distinction between Martha Tabram and the thousands who had died before her in the old streets that had seen plague and fire and every variety of human cruelty across the centuries of their existence. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Desperation. The common lodging houses of Whitechapel were buildings that testified to the particular economics of poverty in late Victorian London. They stood in rows along the narrow streets, their facades indistinguishable from the surrounding tenements, except for the signs that sometimes hung above their doorways advertising beds for the night. Some were purpose-built establishments constructed specifically to house the transient poor. Others were former private residences that had been converted as the district declined and as the demand for cheap accommodation increased. By 1888, there were perhaps hundreds of such houses in Whitechapel and the immediately surrounding areas, containing beds for thousands of people who had no other place to sleep. The largest and most notorious of these establishments stood on Dorset Street, a road that ran for less than 200 yards between Commercial Street and Crispin Street, but that contained within that short distance a concentration of human misery that had earned it the designation of the worst street in London. Number 35, Dorset Street was Crossingham's lodging house, managed by a deputy named Timothy Donovan. The building rose 4 stories, its brick exterior blackened by decades of coal smoke. Inside, it contained dormitories on each floor where beds stood in rows, separated by narrow passages barely wide enough for a person to walk between them. The beds themselves were simple wooden frames supporting thin mattresses that were rarely, if ever, cleaned. Blankets were provided, grey wool that carried the smell of every person who had slept beneath them. The ground floor held the kitchen, a large room with a fireplace at one end and wooden benches arranged around the walls and in the centre. The fire burned day and night during cold weather, providing the only heat in the building. Lodgers could use the fire to boil water if they had tea or to cook food if they had food. More often, they simply sat near it, warming themselves, passing time, conversing with others or sitting in silence with their own thoughts. The kitchen served as the social centre of the lodging house, the place where information was exchanged, where new arrivals were assessed, where the hierarchies and allegiances that governed life in such places were negotiated and maintained. The deputy's role was crucial to the operation of the house. Timothy Donovan sat at a table near the entrance, collecting the fourpence from each lodger who wished to secure a bed for the night. This was his primary function, to ensure that the owner received payment, to turn away those who could not pay, to maintain enough order that the house functioned as a business rather than descending into chaos. He knew the regular lodgers by sight, if not always by name. He knew their habits, knew who could be trusted to pay and who would try to sneak past without paying, knew who caused trouble and who kept to themselves. The payment of fourpence was absolute. No fourpence meant no bed, regardless of the circumstances. A person might have stayed at the house for months or years, might be known to the deputy, might promise to pay the next day. None of this mattered. The economics of the lodging house operated on an immediate cash basis. The owner needed the revenue to cover the costs of maintaining the building, to pay the deputy's wages, to turn a profit. Charity was not part of the business model. Those who could not pay were sent back into the street to find the money or to sleep wherever they could. The alternative to the lodging house was grim. The streets themselves offered no shelter. London in summer was bearable. Though uncomfortable, a person might sleep in a doorway or under an archway and survive the night wet and exhausted but alive. In winter, exposure killed. Every year, bodies were found frozen in alleyways, in parks, on the steps of buildings. People who had simply stopped moving during the night and had not been found until morning, when they were already beyond help. The workhouse was available, but the workhouse required entry through a formal process, required the relinquishment of what little freedom poverty allowed, required submission to rules and labour and separation from family. For many, the lodging house was the least objectionable option, expensive in relative terms, uncomfortable, degrading, but at least temporary, allowing a person to come and go to maintain the illusion of independence. Other lodging houses lined the same streets. The White House on Flower and Dean Street was another large establishment, known for its size and for the roughness of its clientele. Cooney's on Thrall Street, Wilmot's on Brick Lane, the Victoria Home on Commercial Street, which was run by a charitable organisation and was considered slightly more respectable than the purely commercial houses. Each had its character, its reputation, its particular population. The women who would later be known as the victims of the Whitechapel murders moved between these houses, staying at one for a period of days or weeks, then moving to another when circumstances changed or when they quarrelled with a deputy or simply felt the need for a different location. The dormitories where the lodgers slept were arranged with an efficiency that maximised the number of beds that could be fit into the available space. The beds stood in rows, separated by perhaps 2 feet, sometimes less. Above each bed, A number was painted on the wall, corresponding to the record the deputy kept of who had paid for which bed on any given night. Privacy was non-existent. The wooden partitions that separated some beds were low and offered only a symbolic barrier. Sound travelled freely. Coughing, snoring, weeping, the intimate sounds of couples who shared a bed, the arguments and conversations of those who could not sleep. The lodgers themselves were various. Some were labourers who worked irregular jobs, dock work that depended on ships arriving, market work that depended on seasons, casual employment that might last a day or a week. Some were older people who had worked in their youth, but were now beyond the age where employers would hire them. Some were disabled or chronically ill, unable to work but not ill enough to qualify for institutional care. Some were alcoholics whose addiction had destroyed whatever stability they might once have known. And some were women who walked the streets at night, who earned their fourpence through prostitution, who returned to the lodging house in the early morning hours to sleep for a few hours before beginning the cycle again. The rules of the lodging house were simple and strictly enforced. Payment was required in advance. Fighting resulted in immediate expulsion. Theft, if proven, resulted in expulsion and possibly an arrest. Visitors were not allowed in the dormitories. The doors were locked at a certain hour and opened at another, with anyone arriving late required to wake the deputy to be admitted. Cleanliness was encouraged but not enforced. The lodgers used whatever washing facilities were available, usually a communal basin with cold water, and wore whatever clothing they possessed until it fell apart or was sold or pawned. Disease spread easily in such conditions. Tuberculosis was endemic, passed from person to person through the air in the crowded dormitories. Lice and bedbugs infested the mattresses and blankets. Skin infections flourished where multiple people shared unwashed bedding. Cholera had killed thousands in earlier decades, though by 1888 improvements in water supply had reduced the frequency of major outbreaks. But typhus, typhoid, scarlet fever, and a host of other infectious diseases remained constant threats, killing some, weakening others, contributing to the general poor health that characterized the population of the lodging houses. The kitchen provided a space where the lodgers could interact beyond the dormitories. Conversations occurred there that would have been impossible in the sleeping rooms. Information was shared, news of work opportunities, warnings about dangerous customers, gossip about other lodgers, or about events in the wider world. The newspapers were sometimes available, read aloud by those who could read to those who could not. Political discussions occurred occasionally, though most lodgers were too focused on immediate survival to concern themselves much with parliamentary debates or imperial policy. Some lodgers formed relationships in the houses, friendships, partnerships, brief romantic attachments. Others remained isolated, speaking to no one, keeping to themselves, existing in a state of internal exile, even in the midst of the crowded rooms. The transient nature of the population meant that relationships were often temporary. A person might spend weeks conversing with a fellow lodger, sharing a bench by the fire, exchanging life stories, and then one day that person would be gone, having moved to another house or another district, or simply having disappeared into the vast anonymous population of London's poor. The deputies knew more than they generally revealed. They saw who came and went, who had money and who did not, who was drunk and who was sober, who seemed distressed and who seemed content in their limited way. They heard conversations, observed interactions, noted patterns. When police came investigating a crime, the deputy's testimony could be valuable, identifying when a person had last been seen, describing their condition, providing details about their associates. But deputies also understood the value of discretion. Too much cooperation with police could make lodgers uncomfortable, could drive business to other houses. The balance between maintaining order and maintaining business was delicate. By August of 1888, the lodging houses of Whitechapel had become something like villages within the larger city, communities of the desperate where people who had fallen through every other level of society found a temporary place to exist. The architecture was basic: rooms filled with beds, a kitchen with a fire, stairs that creaked, walls that did not quite block sound or cold, windows that looked out onto narrow streets where gaslight barely penetrated. But for those who used them, these houses represented the difference between having a place to sleep and having no place at all, between maintaining some small dignity and complete destitution. The women who later became known as victims had all lived in these houses at various times. They had paid their fourpence to various deputies. They had slept in the dormitories, had sat by the fires in the kitchens, had walked out into the night to earn money and had returned in the morning to sleep. They had known other lodgers, had formed relationships or had remained solitary, had participated in the life of the houses or had merely passed through them. The deputies would remember them after, would testify about them at inquests, would describe their habits, their appearance, the last time they were seen, would provide the details that would allow investigators to reconstruct the final hours of their lives. But in August, before the pattern had become clear, before the murders had achieved their terrible fame, the lodging houses were simply what they had always been, places where the poor slept, where fourpence bought a night's shelter, where the transient population of Whitechapel found temporary refuge from the streets. The buildings would stand for decades more, some of them lasting into the 20th century before being demolished. But they would be remembered primarily for this moment, for the summer and autumn of 1888, when they became the final addresses of women whose deaths would echo across centuries, whose names would be spoken long after the names of everyone who had known them were forgotten, whose brief existence in these narrow buildings on these dark streets would become part of history in a way that no one living there could have anticipated or imagined. Chapter 8. The Language of Violence. The doctors who examined the bodies of the dead in Whitechapel in the year 1888 were men trained in the medical knowledge of their time, which was substantial in some respects and limited in others. They understood human anatomy with considerable precision, having dissected cadavers during their training, having observed the interior structures of the body, having learned to identify organs and tissues and the various systems that kept a living person alive. They understood the mechanics of death in many of its forms, how blood loss killed, how damage to vital organs ceased the body's functions, how disease corrupted and destroyed. But they had no knowledge of forensic pathology as the discipline would later be understood. There were no laboratories where tissue samples could be analysed. There were no microscopes powerful enough to reveal cellular details that might indicate time of death or the nature of weapons used. There was no systematic method for documenting crime scenes photographically or for preserving evidence in ways that would allow later examination. What the doctors possessed was experience. Dr. Timothy Killeen, who had examined Martha Tabram's body, had seen violent death before in his career as a police surgeon. He knew what a knife wound looked like, could distinguish between a cut and a stab, could estimate the length and width of a blade from the characteristics of the wound it produced. He knew how to count wounds, how to describe their locations using anatomical terminology, how to assess which wounds had been inflicted while the victim was still alive and bleeding, and which had been delivered after death when the heart had stopped pumping blood through the circulatory system. The post-mortem examination of Martha Tabram had required several hours. The body had been placed on a wooden table in the mortuary, a room that was cold even in summer, poorly ventilated, lit by whatever daylight came through the high windows and supplemented by oil lamps when necessary. Dr. Killeen had removed the clothing methodically, noting any tears or bloodstains that might provide information about the attack. The clothing had been set aside for police examination. Then the body itself had been examined, wound by wound, region by region. The 39 wounds varied in depth and severity. Some had penetrated only the skin and the layer of fat beneath it. Others had gone deeper, piercing muscle, reaching internal organs. The wounds to the breasts had damaged the mammary tissue but had not reached the lungs beneath. The wounds to the abdomen had been more serious. The liver had been penetrated, the stomach had been pierced, the intestines had been damaged. Any one of several of these wounds might have been fatal if left untreated, though death from abdominal wounds was typically slow, a matter of hours rather than minutes, as internal bleeding and infection gradually overwhelmed the body's capacity to sustain life. The wound to the sternum was anomalous. The breastbone was a thick structure designed to protect the heart and lungs behind it. To penetrate it required either tremendous force or a weapon specifically designed for such penetration. Dr. Killeen had noted that the wound was clean, suggesting a blade with a sharp point, and deep, suggesting a weapon longer and stronger than the penknife that appeared to have caused the other wounds. This single observation had led to the theory that two weapons had been used, which in turn had supported the hypothesis that the killer might have been a soldier with access to both a personal knife and a military bayonet. But Dr. Killeen had been cautious in his conclusions. He understood the limitations of his observations. Wounds were difficult to interpret with certainty. The angle of entry, the position of the victim at the moment of stabbing, the exact force applied. All of these variables affected how a wound appeared and what it revealed about the weapon that had caused it. He could state what he had observed. He could offer opinions based on his experience. But he could not speak with absolute certainty about matters that admitted of multiple interpretations. The pattern of wounds on Martha Tabram's body told a story, though what exactly that story meant was subject to interpretation. The concentration of wounds on the torso, particularly on the breasts and abdomen, suggested that these areas had been the focus of the attack. The sheer number of wounds suggested prolonged violence, an attack that had continued long after the victim was dead or dying. The relative absence of defensive wounds on the hands and arms suggested that the victim had been unable to defend herself, either because the attack had been too sudden, or because she'd been rendered incapable of resistance early in the assault. Dr. Killeen had seen murders before, but the ferocity of this particular attack had been notable even to his experienced eye. Stabbing was a common method of murder in the East End, where knives were readily available and guns were expensive and difficult to obtain. But most stabbings involved a small number of wounds, 1 or 2 or 3, delivered in the heat of a quarrel or during a robbery. 39 wounds spoke of something beyond the normal parameters of violent crime. It suggested rage or sexual frenzy or madness, or some combination of these that had driven the killer to continue stabbing long after any practical purpose had been served. The doctors who later examined the bodies of other victims would make similar observations. The pattern would become clearer as more deaths occurred. Attacks focused on the throat and abdomen, mutilation of the reproductive organs, removal of internal organs in some cases, a progression from simple murder to something that resembled dissection. But in August of 1888, with only Martha Tabram's body to examine, Dr. Killeen could not yet see this pattern. He simply documented what he found, provided his professional opinion about the weapons used and the cause of death, and testified at the inquest as the law required. The police relied heavily on medical testimony and murder investigations. The doctor's report often provided the only objective evidence available, the only facts that did not depend on the uncertain memory of witnesses or the potential dishonesty of suspects. What the doctor said about time of death helped establish timelines. What he said about the weapon helped focus the search. What he said about the nature of the attack helped investigators understand what kind of person they were looking for. But medical evidence had its limitations. Time of death could be estimated only approximately, based on the temperature of the body, the degree of rigor mortis, the state of decomposition if the body had not been found immediately. These indicators provided rough parameters. Death had occurred within the last few hours, or within the last day, but could not pinpoint the exact moment with precision. The estimation of weapons based on wound characteristics was similarly imprecise. A knife wound might have been caused by any of dozens of different types of blades. A doctor could say that the weapon was approximately this long, approximately this wide, but could not identify the specific knife without having it in hand for comparison. The question of motive was beyond the doctor's purview. Dr. Killeen could describe the wounds, could note their location and severity, could observe that the attack had been focused on particular areas of the body. But why the killer had chosen to attack in this way, what purpose the violence had served beyond causing death, what psychological or sexual motivations might have driven the assault, these were matters of speculation, not medical fact. The doctors of 1888 knew little of what would later be called criminal psychology. They understood that some people were insane, that insanity could manifest in violent behavior, but the systematic study of criminal minds, the categorization of different types of killers and their motives, the understanding of serial murder as a distinct phenomenon, all of this lay in the future. What the doctors could observe was that the violence inflicted on women like Martha Tabram exceeded what was necessary to cause death. This excess suggested something beyond simple murder. A person who killed for robbery needed only to incapacitate the victim, not to stab them 36 times. A person who killed in a sudden rage might strike multiple blows, but typically ceased once the victim was clearly dead. The continuation of violence after death suggested either that the killer was unable to control himself, or that the violence itself was the purpose, not merely a means to another end. The medical profession in 1888 was divided on questions of criminal responsibility. Some doctors held that insanity could excuse criminal behavior, that a person who was genuinely mad could not be held morally or legally responsible for actions committed while in a state of mental derangement. Others argued that even the insane bore responsibility for their actions, that madness did not eliminate the fundamental human capacity for choice, that criminals who claimed insanity were often merely attempting to avoid punishment. The courts generally took the position that insanity was a defence only in cases where the accused could not distinguish right from wrong, where their mental condition was so severe that they literally did not understand the nature of their actions. None of this philosophical debate had immediate relevance to Dr. Killeen's examination of Martha Tabram. His task was to determine cause of death, to describe the injuries, to provide whatever information might assist the police investigation. He had done this to the best of his ability. The fact that his testimony had not led to an arrest was not a failure of medical science, but a reflection of the difficulty of solving crimes where the killer left no clear evidence and where witnesses could not provide reliable identification. The language that doctors used to describe violence was technical, deliberately distanced from the emotional impact of what they were describing. A wound was a wound, documented by location and dimensions, classified by type, incised, punctured, lacerated. An organ was damaged or undamaged, penetrated or intact. Death resulted from specific physiological failures, exsanguination meaning blood loss, peritonitis meaning infection of the abdominal cavity, shock meaning the body's system shutting down in response to trauma. This clinical language allowed doctors to discuss terrible things without being overwhelmed by the horror of them. It allowed them to maintain the professional detachment necessary to perform their work, but the clinical language also created a distance between the facts of violence and the human reality of it. Martha Tabram had not simply sustained 39 wounds. She had been stabbed 39 times by a person who had held a knife and had driven it into her body again and again while she died. The abstract description of injuries, necessary as it was for legal and investigative purposes, could not capture the terror of those final moments, the pain of the first wounds, the confusion and fear as the attack continued, the gradual dimming of consciousness as blood loss and shock took effect. The doctors knew this in their way. They were not callous men. They understood that the bodies they examined had been living people with their own histories and hopes and sorrows. But their professional role required them to focus on the physical evidence, to set aside emotion in favour of observation, to serve the law by providing facts that could be entered into evidence and used to pursue justice. They did their work as well as the knowledge of their time allowed. They measured and documented and testified, and then they returned to their other duties, to the treatment of the living, to the endless succession of illnesses and injuries that filled their days, leaving behind only the reports they had written, the careful descriptions of wounds and causes of death that would be filed away in the records of inquests and police investigations. In the rooms where these examinations occurred, in the cold stone chambers of the mortuaries where the dead waited for burial, the language of violence was spoken in medical Latin and technical terminology, in measurements and classifications that reduced horror to data. But the horror remained, embedded in the facts, visible to anyone who read the reports and understood what they described. 39 wounds, penetration of vital organs, death from blood loss and shock. These phrases, clinical and precise, spoke of moments of extreme violence, of a life ended with terrible deliberation, of suffering that no amount of medical language could fully obscure or explain. Chapter 9. The Streets After Dark. When the sun set over Whitechapel, the character of the district changed. The transformation was gradual, beginning in the late afternoon, as the light began to fade, accelerating as evening came on and the lamps were lit, reaching its full expression in the hours after midnight, when only those who had reason to be abroad remained in the streets. The respectable working people, the clerks and shopkeepers and skilled labourers who maintained some claim to social standing, withdrew into their homes, locking their doors, leaving the streets to those whose business or desperation kept them out through the dark hours. The gaslights that illuminated Whitechapel were irregularly spaced and provided only uncertain illumination. The main thoroughfares, Whitechapel Road, Commercial Street, Leman Street, had lamps at intervals that allowed a person to see where they were walking, though the light was yellow and dim, casting shadows that moved with the flickering of the flames. The smaller streets had fewer lamps. The courts and alleyways often had none at all combed, relying on whatever light spilled from nearby lamps or from the windows of buildings whose residents kept candles or small oil lamps burning. In these dark spaces, vision became unreliable. A person standing in an alley might be visible only as a shape, a silhouette without detail. Faces were difficult to distinguish. Colours became shades of grey. The darkness provided privacy of a sort, though it was a privacy that worked both ways. Those who sought concealment for innocent or criminal purposes found it easily. But those who moved through the dark streets also walked, without knowing who might be watching from doorways or following a few paces behind. The constables who patrolled Whitechapel at night walked their beats according to fixed routes and schedules. Each beat covered a specific area, and the constable assigned to it was required to traverse his route at regular intervals, checking that shops were locked, investigating any disturbances, providing whatever visible presence might deter crime, or at least allow for rapid response when crimes occurred. The beats overlapped so that no area was left completely unpatrolled, but the nature of the work meant that any given street might see a constable pass by once every 30 minutes or hour, with long periods between patrols when the streets were empty of official authority. The constables carried bullseye lanterns, devices that allowed them to direct a beam of light in a specific direction, while keeping the lantern otherwise shuttered. These were useful for examining doorways and alleyways, for checking the identities of people stopped for questioning, for signalling to other constables if assistance was needed. But the lanterns also announced the constable's presence, making it impossible to move silently or to observe criminal activity without being noticed. The rattle of equipment, the measured tread of boots on cobblestones, the occasional flash of the bullseye lantern, all of these indicated that the law was nearby, which served to reassure the honest and to warn the dishonest. The public houses closed at midnight on weekdays, at midnight on Saturday nights. The law required this, and the publicans generally complied, though some establishments served drinks after hours to trusted customers or to those willing to pay extra for the privilege. At closing time, the pubs emptied their patrons into the streets, men who'd been drinking since the end of the workday, women who had spent their earnings on gin, couples who had met in the warm interior and now faced the decision of where to go next. Some went home to whatever lodging they could afford. Some went to the coffee stalls that operated through the night, serving cheap food to those who had money and hunger. Some simply stood on the street corners, unwilling or unable to face returning to cold rooms or to the lodging houses where they had no money for a bed. The women who worked the streets emerged more fully into visibility after the pubs closed. During the earlier evening hours, they had been less conspicuous, mixed in with the other people who filled the streets and the public houses. But as the respectable population withdrew and as the hour grew late, those who remained were increasingly recognizable by their purpose. They stood in doorways or walked slowly along certain well-known stretches of pavement, waiting for men who wanted what they offered. The transaction followed patterns that had been established over years of similar encounters. A brief conversation, the man indicating interest, the woman naming a price, the two of them negotiating if necessary or simply agreeing and moving toward wherever the act would occur. The locations were various: alleyways too narrow for through traffic, courtyards accessible from the street, the staircases of tenement buildings, occasionally a room in a lodging house if the woman had a bed and if the deputy would allow it. The act itself was quick, a matter of minutes. Then the man departed and the woman returned to her corner to wait for the next customer. The police knew the women by sight. A constable walking his beat might see the same faces night after night, positioned at the same corners, wearing the same worn clothing. The law against solicitation was enforced selectively. A woman who conducted herself quietly, who did not accost men too boldly, who caused no public disturbance, might be left alone by the constables who saw her. A woman who was drunk and loud, who argued with customers in the street, who ignored warnings to move along might be arrested and brought before a magistrate the following morning to be fined a few shillings or sentenced to a few days in jail. The relationship between the prostitutes and the police was complex. The constables were not protectors exactly, but neither were they purely adversarial. A woman who was assaulted might seek out a constable for help, and might receive it if the constable was inclined to intervene. A constable who witnessed a man becoming violent with a woman might intervene to prevent serious harm, though whether he would take the matter further depended on circumstances and on his individual judgment. The women knew which constables were reasonable and which were harsh. They knew when to approach the police and when to avoid them. They navigated the relationship as they navigated everything else in their lives. Cautiously, pragmatically, aware that the law was not designed to protect them, but that individual officers sometimes might. The streets after dark held other inhabitants besides the prostitutes and the police. Night workers moved through the darkness, market porters heading to their early morning shifts, bakers preparing for the day's trade, stablemen tending horses, cab drivers ferrying passengers. Criminals operated as well, pickpockets working the crowds that emerged from the pubs, burglars watching for opportunities, confidence men seeking victims, thieves of every variety using the darkness to conceal their movements. The homeless slept in whatever sheltered spots they could find, under archways, in doorways, in the recesses of buildings where they might be partly protected from rain and wind. The sounds of the night streets were distinctive. Footsteps echoed differently in the quiet than they did during the busy hours of day. Voices carried farther. A shout or scream that might be lost in the daytime noise became immediately audible at night, though whether anyone responded to such sounds depended on their nature and on the inclinations of those who heard them. A woman's screaming might bring no response at all. Screams were common enough in Whitechapel, the result of fights or drunkenness or the ordinary violence of poverty, and most residents had learned not to investigate unless the disturbance was directly outside their own doors. The darkness also concealed. A person could move through the streets at night with little chance of being observed in detail. In the main thoroughfares where the gaslights provided some illumination, a constable or other witness might be able to later describe seeing a person of a certain general appearance, tall or short, well-dressed or poorly dressed, walking quickly or slowly. But in the darker areas, even these basic observations became unreliable. A person might pass within a few feet of a witness and leave no impression except a vague sense of another human presence. This quality of the nighttime streets, the combination of activity and anonymity, of visibility and concealment, made them ideal for certain types of crime. Robbery could be committed with less risk of identification. Assaults could occur in alleyways where no witness would see clearly enough to provide useful testimony. And murder, if the killer chose his location carefully and acted quickly, might be accomplished with little chance of being observed or interrupted. The women who walked the streets understood the risks. They had heard stories of other women who had been attacked, robbed, beaten, killed. Some of them had experienced violence themselves, customers who refused to pay, who became rough during the act, who produced weapons and demanded money as well as sex. But the knowledge of risk did not eliminate the necessity of taking risks. A woman who needed fourpence for a bed could not refuse all customers out of caution. She could try to assess them, to avoid those who seemed particularly dangerous, to stay in areas where foot traffic remained steady. But ultimately, she had to accept a certain level of risk as the price of earning money. The particular geography of Whitechapel provided numerous locations where violence could occur unseen. The courts and alleyways that branched off from the main streets created pockets of darkness where a person could commit an assault and depart without witnesses. George Yard, where Martha Tabram had been killed, was typical, a passage connecting two larger streets, lined with buildings whose residents might hear sounds from the yard, but could not see into it from their windows, dark enough at night that even someone on the stairs of George Yard buildings might see another person only as a shape without clear features. The police attempted to maintain control through regular patrols, through arrests of those who committed crimes, through their visible presence on the streets. But the constables were outnumbered. H Division employed a few hundred men to cover a district containing hundreds of thousands of people, and containing a geography so complex that surveillance of every dark corner was impossible. The beats were designed to provide coverage, but coverage did not mean constant observation. A constable might pass a particular alley every 30 minutes, which meant that for 28 or 29 of those 30 minutes, the alley was unwatched. The criminal population understood this. They learned the patterns of the police patrols, learned when constables would be in particular areas and when those areas would be empty. They learned which routes allowed for quick escape, which buildings had multiple exits, which streets were too well lit or too heavily patrolled to be useful. This was knowledge that was shared, passed from one criminal to another, refined through experience, part of the informal education that allowed the underworld of Whitechapel to operate despite the efforts of the law to suppress it. By August of 1888, the streets of Whitechapel after dark had settled into patterns that had been established over years, perhaps over decades. The same corners saw the same activities, the same types of crimes occurred in the same types of locations, the same women walked the same routes, offering themselves to the same kinds of men. It was a world that operated according to its own rhythms and rules, existing in parallel to the respectable world of daylight and employment and social propriety, occasionally intersecting with that world but largely separate from it. And into this world, into these dark streets where violence was common and witnesses were scarce, and the poor preyed upon one another while the law attempted inadequately to maintain order, a killer moved. He moved unseen, or seen only as one more anonymous figure among thousands. He encountered women who had no reason to fear him beyond the baseline fear they felt toward all customers. He led them into dark places where no one would interrupt, and he killed them there, in the passages and courts and staircases of Whitechapel, in the geography that had been designed without thought of murder, but that served the purpose perfectly, that provided the privacy and the darkness that made killing possible and escape likely. The streets after dark held all of this, the ordinary and the terrible, the desperate commerce of survival, and the incomprehensible violence that would soon make Whitechapel a name spoken across the world. In August, before the pattern had become clear, before the murders had achieved their fame, these were simply the streets of the East End as they had always been. Dark, dangerous, filled with people living at the edge of existence, indifferent to individual suffering, ancient in their cruelty, awaiting only the catalyst that would transform them from a place of ordinary misery into a theatre where extraordinary horror would be enacted before an audience of millions who would read about it in newspapers and would wonder from the safety of their distant homes how such things could happen in the heart of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Chapter 10. The Threshold of Autumn. August drew toward its close in weather that remained warm despite the calendar's movement toward the autumn months. The 25th of the month fell on a Saturday, and the streets of Whitechapel followed their customary weekend patterns, the markets busy with those who had been paid their weekly wages, the public houses full from early afternoon, the traffic of people and vehicles making the main thoroughfares difficult to navigate, the narrow side streets and courts relatively quiet by comparison, as residents sought escape from the heat in whatever shaded or cool spaces they could find. The summer of 1888 had been unremarkable in most respects. The weather had alternated between rain and sun as English weather always did. The political news had been dominated by matters that seemed important at the time but would fade quickly from memory. Debates in Parliament, developments in Ireland where the question of Home Rule continued to divide the nation, events in various parts of the empire that merited brief attention before being superseded by newer events. In Whitechapel itself, life had continued according to its established patterns, people working when work could be found, drinking when money allowed, struggling to maintain the minimal level of existence that separated survival from complete destitution. 2 women had died violently during the summer, but violent death was not unusual in the East End. Emma Smith in April, Martha Tabram in August. Their murders had been noted, investigated, and when the investigations had produced no arrests, had been filed away as unsolved cases that would likely remain unsolved. The police had other crimes to investigate, other problems to address. The newspapers had other stories to tell. The women themselves had been buried in paupers' graves and forgotten, except by the few who had known them personally. But the forgetting would not last. Within a matter of days, the name Whitechapel would become synonymous with horror, with unsolved mystery, with a particular type of crime that would fascinate and repel in equal measure. The murders that were about to occur would be investigated more thoroughly than any crimes in the history of British policing. They would be covered by newspapers around the world. They would generate theories and suspects by the hundreds, none of which would lead to conviction. They would create a legend that would outlast the Victorian era, that would persist into the 20th century and beyond, that would make the name Jack the Ripper known even to people who knew nothing else about Victorian London or the history of criminal investigation. But on the 25th of August, none of this had happened yet. The threshold had not been crossed. The pattern had not emerged clearly enough to be recognised. The police were investigating 2 murders that seemed unconnected except by the general circumstances of their victims' lives. The women of Whitechapel continued to walk their nightly rounds, aware of the risks as they had always been aware, taking what precautions seemed reasonable, earning their fourpence for a bed, surviving from night to night in the only ways available to them. The lodging houses filled each evening with their usual populations. At 35 Dorset Street, Timothy Donovan collected his fourpences from the lodgers who could pay and turned away those who could not. At 18 George Street, the deputy performed the same function. The women who had lived in these houses and who would soon die had not yet achieved the distinction that death would bring them. They were anonymous among the anonymous, unremarkable even in their poverty, noticed by those immediately around them, but leaving no impression on the wider world that would have suggested their lives or deaths merited special attention. The transition from August to September would occur in a few days. The calendar would turn, the weather would begin its slow shift toward autumn, and the long darkness of the coming winter would become perceptible in the earlier sunsets and later sunrises. For most residents of Whitechapel, this transition was merely another marker in the endless succession of days that constituted their existence. Another month survived, another season approaching, the eternal cycle continuing without regard for individual hopes or fears. The police at Leman Street prepared for the coming month as they prepared for all months, by maintaining their patrols, by investigating whatever crimes occurred, by attempting to keep order in a district where order was always temporary and always incomplete. Inspector Reid and his colleagues had no reason to expect that September would be different from August. They anticipated the usual run of crimes: thefts, assaults, domestic violence, the occasional murder. They had no warning that they were about to be confronted with a series of crimes that would challenge every assumption they held about criminal investigation, that would strain their resources beyond capacity, that would expose the limitations of Victorian policing in ways that would lead to fundamental reforms in the decades to come. The newspapers prepared their editions with the usual mix of news: politics, commerce, society events, crime reports, advertisements. The East London Advertiser and the East London Observer covered their territory with the attention appropriate to local publications, reporting on matters that might not merit coverage in the larger London papers, but that were of interest to residents of the district served. They had reported on Emma Smith's death in April, on Martha Tabram's death in August. They would report on what was coming with increasing intensity, their coverage growing from brief notices to lengthy articles to special editions as the story developed, and as the demand for information exceeded the supply of facts. The transition that was about to occur was not visible to those who were living through it. History reveals its patterns in retrospect, connecting events that seemed unrelated at the time they occurred, showing how one thing led to another in ways that participants could not perceive. Emma Smith and Martha Tabram had died without knowing that their deaths would later be examined as possible first victims of a series. The women who were about to die could not know that their deaths would be different, that they would be remembered, that their names would be spoken and written millions of times in the century and more that would follow. The city itself was indifferent to what was coming. London had absorbed violence for centuries: wars, rebellions, plagues, fires, the constant background noise of crime and punishment that characterized urban existence. A few more deaths, even particularly brutal deaths, would not alter the fundamental character of the city. The Thames would continue to flow, the markets would continue to operate. The ships would continue to arrive at the docks. The machinery of commerce and government and daily life would continue to function, regardless of what occurred in the dark streets of Whitechapel. But for those who lived in those dark streets, for the women who walked them at night, for the police who attempted to protect them, for the witnesses who would find bodies in courtyards and alleyways, for the doctors who would examine those bodies and testify at inquests, for the journalists who would report the story and the readers who would follow it with fascinated horror, for all of these the coming weeks would be transformative. They would experience events that would become defining memories, that would shape the rest of their lives, that would place them at the centre of a historical moment whose significance would only grow with time. The threshold of autumn in 1888 was the threshold of something more than seasonal change. It was the moment before the storm, the pause before the violence, the last quiet hours before Whitechapel became the most famous slum in the world. The women who were about to die went about their final days in ignorance of what awaited them. They sought customers, earned their money, paid for their beds, drank their gin, quarrelled with their acquaintances, made whatever plans their circumstances allowed for the days and weeks ahead. They had survived this long through decades of poverty and hardship, and they had no reason to believe that the coming days would be different from all the days that had preceded them. The architecture of the city remained unchanged. The narrow courts, the dark alleyways, the lodging houses with their rows of beds, the public houses with their warm interiors and cold exteriors, the churches and missions and workhouses and all the other structures that constituted the physical environment of the East End. But this architecture was about to become a stage, and what would be performed on that stage would echo across time in ways that no amount of demolition or reconstruction could erase. George Yard buildings, where Martha Tabram had died, would stand for years more, but it would forever be associated with that August night when a woman's body had been discovered on its stairs. The locations that were about to become murder sites would carry that association permanently, marked by history in ways invisible to the eye, but indelible in memory and record. The people who would play roles in the coming drama, the victims, the witnesses, the investigators, the journalists, were all present in Whitechapel as August ended. They moved through their ordinary lives, unaware that they were about to become part of something extraordinary. They slept in their beds or on the streets. They worked or sought work. They drank, quarrelled, laughed, wept, conducted the small transactions that made up the fabric of daily existence. And they waited, though they did not know they were waiting, for the moment when ordinary time would end and historical time would begin. The final days of August passed. The 26th, the 27th, the 28th. Each day brought Whitechapel closer to the moment of transformation. The heat persisted, making sleep difficult, driving people into the streets even in the late hours when darkness would normally have kept them indoors. The gas lights burned. The constables walked their beats, the women stood at their corners, and somewhere in the darkness, unidentified, unrecognized, moving through the same streets as everyone else, the killer prepared for what would come next. The threshold of autumn was the threshold of horror. Beyond it lay September, and what September would bring. Beyond it lay the canonical 5 murders that would define the Whitechapel case, the victims whose names would be remembered: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Beyond it lay the letters claiming to be from the killer, the name Jack the Ripper entering the language, the worldwide panic and fascination, the investigation that would involve multiple police forces and hundreds of suspects and would ultimately solve nothing. But on these last days of August, none of that had happened yet. The story was unwritten. The victims were still alive. The terror had not yet begun. Whitechapel existed in the final moment of its old identity, before it became the Whitechapel of legend, the Whitechapel of nightmare, the place where the most famous unsolved murders in history occurred, in the autumn of 1888 when the gaslights burned low, and the ancient streets ran with blood, and the city discovered that civilization was a thinner veneer than anyone had wanted to believe. The calendar turned toward September. The sun set on the 31st of August. The darkness came, as it always came, over the old streets where history had watched for centuries and where history was about to witness something it had not seen before. The threshold was crossed. Autumn began. And in a stable yard off Bucks Row, in the early hours of a Friday morning, a woman named Mary Ann Nichols would be found dead with her throat cut and her abdomen mutilated, and the world would learn the name Whitechapel, and the name would never be forgotten. The candle burned low in the window of the lodging house. The footsteps faded in the darkness of the alley, and the city, unknowing, turned its face toward the horror that awaited, while the old streets held their breath, and the past prepared to meet the future in the most terrible way imaginable.